All right, well, welcome
Yeah.
everyone. It is, I think, 12:01, so I'm going to go ahead and get us started. It is delightful to see everyone here today. The Zoom screen is just teeming with boxes, which means there's lots of you. So welcome to the Tulane School of Medicine lecture series. I have a little presentation I'd like to share with you before we turn to our speakers. Okay, can you guys see my screen? Tiffy or Stephen, please.
Yes, we can see you.
Yes, I apologize. I was muted.
Thank you. Thank you, Angela. All right. Well, and by the way, my name is Dr. Valerie Holliday. I am a faculty in the program in Medical Ethics and Human Values. We are presenting the J.R. Williams Senior MD of 1931 endowed lecture entitled Communities of Care, Hierarchies of Knowledge. And our two presenters today, I am delighted to bring from Louisiana State University. First, Dr. Elsie Michie, Associate Dean in the College of Humanities and Social Sciences and Professor of English at LSU, and Dr. Deborah Goldgaber, Director of the LSU Ethics Institute and Associate Professor of Philosophy and Women's and Gender and Sexuality Studies, also at Louisiana State. The J.R. Williams Senior MD 1931 Endowed Lecture Fund was initiated in the fall of 2013. This endowment supports lectures on spirituality and health at Tulane University School of Medicine. We focus on the art of creating compassionate and trusting relationships between the patient and the doctor. The series honors the legacy of Dr. J. Richard Williams, MD, a Tulane University graduate, who was a well-known and well-loved internist and oncologist in Selma, Alabama. Dr. Williams loved medicine and was the kind of doctor who would do anything for his patient, with an interest in the impact of spirituality on health, particularly on the positive impact of spirituality on the well-being and continued health of those who have suffered the loss of a loved one. We are, our Master's in Science program in Bioethics and Medical Humanities is our co-sponsors. We are on the web at tulane.edu/bioethics. And we're also on YouTube. Just do a search for Tulane Bioethics. For information, please see our information session at bit.ly/2MMU3UX. We also have a QR code there if you can whip out your phone and scan it really fast. Our curriculum in this program has two tracks. The bioethics track focuses on teaching, research, and service through hospital ethics committee and institutional review board service, teaching in all healthcare settings, and conducting normative and empirical research in healthcare ethics issues. Our medical humanities track focuses on teaching or research on those aspects of narrative reflective writing, fine arts, and history as applied to healthcare. We have a 2-year Master's of Science program. We have an integrated dual degree 4-year program that works concomitantly with the MD curriculum. And we also have a flexible faculty development option for mid-career professionals. If you're interested, we have Dr. Jafit Ofengenden is actually here today with us, and also Dr. Stephen Hansen, the director of the Graduate Studies program, and Dr. Ofengenden is the program coordinator. You're welcome to contact them for further information. Okay. All right. Well, without further ado, Dr. Michie is Associate Dean in the College of Humanities and Social Sciences. She is also a professor of English, an expert in the Victorian novel. She writes literary criticism that is informed by feminist theory. Her work has appeared in such journals as Publications of the Modern Language Association, English Literary History, Novel, Victorian Studies, and 19th Century Literature, among other venues. She has edited or co-edited 3 essay collections and 2 book manuscripts, and written 2 single-authored books, Outside the Pale, Cultural Exclusion, Gender Difference, and the Victorian Woman Writer in 1993, and The Vulgar Question of Money, Heiresses, Materialism, and the Novel of Manners from Jane Austen to Henry James, published in 2011. And our second speaker, Dr. Deborah Goldgaber, is Associate Professor of Philosophy with an appointment in Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies. She's the Director of the Ethics Institute, and her areas of expertise include contemporary French philosophy, feminist philosophy, and social epistemology. Without further ado, I am going to turn it over to Dr. Michie to begin her talk, Communities of Care.
So thank you all for coming. I'm really pleased to be talking with you. This is an issue in feminist theory that I think is really fascinating and important. I'm not going to do PowerPoints because I'm old-fashioned. So I'm going to read my talk as I would do if I were in your physical presence. I put my email address online, and I also have sent a copy of my paper to Dr. Holliday. So if you want a copy complete with works cited, you can get copies from either one of us. All right, here goes. And I'm looking forward also, I should say, to questions afterwards. Communities of care. Care ethics is not a claim about women's essential nature or about women's universal oppression. It is not an exhortation for us all to care more or to be more caring. Care ethics is a critical feminist theory that seeks to reveal the different forms of power that keep the values and activities of care hidden from public view, and to demonstrate the devastating effects that ensue when care is consistently devalued, sidelined, and subordinated. That's from Fiona Robinson's Care Ethics, Political Thinking, and the Future of Feminism. I want to begin by rehearsing the famous section of Carol Gilligan's In a Different Voice, which some of you may have read in your feminist theory and practice in medicine class. And if you haven't taken it, I encourage you to take it. There, Gilligan analyzes a 6th grade boys and girls' differing responses to the Kohlberg morality test. In that test, participants were asked to consider whether it would be moral for a man named Heinz to steal a drug he cannot afford in order to save his wife's life. The 11-year-old boy, Jake, immediately judges that Heinz should steal the drug. And the boy's reasoning is clear, quote, "A human life is worth more than money. And if the druggist only makes $1,000, he is going to live. But if Heinz doesn't steal the drug, his wife is going to die." The girl, Amy, responds to the hypothetical moral dilemma with less absoluteness. She doesn't think that Heinz should steal the drug because, quote, "There are other ways besides stealing it, like if he could borrow money or make a loan. If he stole the drug, he might save his wife then, but if he did, he might have to go to jail and his wife might get sicker again." Amy's judgment is grounded in the belief that, quote, "if somebody has something that would keep somebody alive, then it's not right to give it, then it's not right not to give it to them." She is confident that if Heinz and the druggist had talked it out long enough, they could reach something besides stealing. In analyzing the incident, Gilligan refuses to endorse Kohlberg's conclusion that the boy's moral development is higher than the girl's. Instead, for Gilligan, Amy's view represents a different form of morality, one that, quote, "sees a world comprised of relationships rather than of people standing alone, a world that coheres through human connection rather than through systems of rules." Written in 1982, Gilligan's refusal and reassessment of Kohlberg's assumptions about moral development spawned a whole intellectual movement that is still vital and growing in the present moment, almost 40 years after she first published her book. In the brief talk that follows, I will give an overview of that philosophical movement, the ethics of care, an approach that is, I argue, particularly important for those of us like teachers and medical professionals whose work is defined as centering on care. Gilligan's contemporary, the educational theorist Nell Noddings, came to the same conclusion as Gilligan, arguing that, quote, "ethics, the philosophical study of morality has concentrated for the most part on moral reasoning. For Noddings and for other feminists of the period, moral reasoning was implicitly gendered masculine, and its opposite feminine. That is, their thinking about ethics was associated with works like Nancy Chodorov's 1978 book, The Reproduction of Mothering, which began to think about what moral values or positions were exemplified by the mother. In Nodding's words, ethics has been discussed largely in the language of the father, in principles and propositions, in terms such as justification, fairness, and justice. The mother's voice has been largely silent. Human caring and the memory of caring and being cared for, which I will argue form the foundation of ethical response, have not received enough attention. The mission then for various feminists of the 1980s was to make visible, to give voice to attempt to map out the alternative form of ethical behavior associated with caring rather than judgment. For Noddings, caring is, quote, feminine in the deep classic sense, rooted in reciprocity, relatedness, and responsiveness. Her fellow educational theorist, Jane Martin, calls it the 3 C's, care, concern, and connection. For political theorist Joan Tronto, care necessitates attentiveness, responsibility, competence, and responsiveness. The emphasis on connectedness in all these definitions is key to the way the ethics of care evolved as a field. It was centrally about the relation between self and other, or between carer and cared for. In Nodding's words, when I look at and think about how I am when I care, I realize that there is invariably this displacement of interest from my own reality to the reality of the other. However, what happened as the ethics of care movement evolved was that these realizations, which initially sprang from very concrete situations like the Kohlberg morality test or the mother's relation to her child, came to be seen less as a direct reflection of the dynamics of the family and more as essential to reconceiving the entire human condition. For later thinkers in the ethical movement, the maternal relation becomes a paradigm, an analog for social relations in which vulnerability is central. This shift in thinking is particularly clear in the work of Virginia Held and Eva Kittay, both of whom began to revise and expand the terms for thinking about care in the 1990s. As Held put it, the ethics of care has the potential of being based on the truly universal experience of care. Every human being has been cared for as a child or wouldn't be alive. Kittay argued even more forcefully that, quote, we might even say that the long maturation process of humans, combined with the decidedly human capacities for moral feeling and attachment, make caring for dependence a mark of our humanity. Kittay's work transformed the nature of the field by focusing not just on caring, but on the other half of the caring relationship, the position of the cared for, who experiences what Kittay calls dependency. Though we often think of dependency as a temporary state, something to be endured or lived through in order to then become more self-reliant or self-sufficient, virtues much praised by political thinkers like Ralph Waldo Emerson, Kittay argues instead that dependency is not exceptional, but integral to human life. We are all dependents as infants and again in our old age. Given the immutable facts of human development, disease, and decline, no culture that endures beyond one generation can be secure against the claims of human dependency. And for Kittay, this realization has the potential to revolutionize the whole concept of social equality. In her words, grasping the moral value of the relation between unequals in a dependency relation will bring us closer to a new assessment of equality itself. Rather than equality based on properties that adhere to individuals, we develop an equality wherein the condition of its possibility is the inevitability of human interdependence. If we begin thinking with persons as they are in connections of care and concern, we consider commonalities that characterize this relatedness. These would form the basis of a connection-based equality rather than an individual-based equality. The individual-based equality more familiar to us. The question for a connection-based equality is not what rights are due to me by virtue of my status as an equal, such that those rights are consistent with all other individuals who have the status of an equal. Instead, the question is, what are my responsibilities to others with whom I stand in specific relations? And what are the responsibilities of others to me so that I can be well cared for and have my needs addressed even as I care for and respond to the needs of those who depend on me. Thus, for Kate, the caring relationship involves not only the carer and the cared for, but also a larger social system, a group of individuals that she calls a dulia, who will also give care workers the support they need to do their jobs well. Almost 20 years after the publication of In a Different Voice, Kate's Love's Labors provides a full explanation of the political and social implications of the logic that 11-year-old Amy automatically practiced when she was presented with the moral dilemma of Heinz, his dying wife, and the pharmacist. In her 2021 book, Communities of Care, Talia Schaffer has argued that, quote, classical liberal thought relies on the assumption that people are liberal individuals in the marketplace, independent, autonomous, and rational, able to make rational choices in everything from market behavior to votes. This is, of course, the worldview that, as his response to Heinz's moral dilemma shows, the 6th grade boy Jay has already internalized and mastered at 11 years old. And this mastery leads him to be assessed as having developed the capacity for moral judgment appropriate for his grade level. But what if, as feminist theorists of ethics like Noddings, Help, and Kate have argued since the 1980s, we view Amy as taking a different but equally important moral stance? What if we see caring relationships as stronger than rational contracts? What if, in Kate's words, care bonds make civic order and civic friendship possible? Then the ethics of care, built out of concern and mutual responsiveness, can provide a model for rethinking social interaction and moral values in both the personal and wider social arenas. And this is where the ethics of care movement has gone in the 21st century. In fact, the book I just quoted from was published 2 weeks ago. I was so happy to have it right before I gave my talk. As professor of public policy and leadership at the University of Houston, Daniel Engster puts it in writing about care, ethics, and politics. Because human beings universally depend on one another for care, we all have moral obligations to care for others in need. While we can fulfill some of our obligations to others through personal caring relationships, we can fulfill many others only through collective caring institutions and policies. Our moral obligation to care for others thus generate collective responsibilities to organize our political, economic, international, and cultural institutions, at least in part, to support caring practices and care for individuals in need. This is the moment in which the ethics of care begins to be about communities of care, and in which that philosophy intersects with and builds on work about community that comes out of disability studies, queer theory, intersectionality theory, critical race theory, and so many other disciplines. It is also, I would argue, the space in which you all will make your professional lives. That space will necessitate thinking about caring and dependency, power and vulnerability, and the interconnectedness of all individuals. It will mean, as Noddings argue, that you will repeatedly be asked to displace interest from your own life onto the lives of others. The ethics of care movement invites you, in the words of my epigraph, to think about caring and care not in sentimental or emotional terms, but as active practices, social forces, powerful stances, whose visibility and value can change the way you relate to others from a local to an international level, from daily interactions to a lifetime of commitment. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yes, we're going to give you the
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I should have said this before you started speaking, Dr. Michi, but what I'm gonna do is, if you have questions or comments or things you would like a speaker to elaborate on, we're gonna have a period of question and answer at the end. If please write your question in the chat, and we will be sure to address it after Dr. Goldgaber's talk. So without further ado, thank you so much, Dr. Michie. That was awesome. And now we turn to Dr. Goldgaber for hierarchies of knowledge.
Okay, hopefully everyone can see that, and I can see it too, which is good. Okay, I'm going to be talking.
Absolutely.
I'm going to be talking about, and this is just in the most general terms to give you a lay of the land of what I take feminist epistemology to be doing as a practice, and why I think it might be important for you as practitioners, researchers, teachers to know about its work and the significance of it. I have offered you some sources at the end, and I'm very happy to share this slideshow with anybody who is interested. So I'm going to begin. It was All Saints Day yesterday, and that's the traditional day when you go to visit the cemeteries, and both of my grandparents are dead, and so I was thinking about them. And this is a picture of my grandmother, Larissa Ryder, who was a Soviet doctor. And so it's a little backstory to sort of get you in the mood for thinking about gender essentialism and what that might mean and why it might be pertinent for medicine. So my grandmother was a Soviet doctor, and growing up, I had asked her questions about what it was like to practice medicine in the Soviet Union. And I grew up in the United States in a culture where I had learned to value the status and authority of doctors. And I assumed, of course, that the situation of doctors in the United States was the same roughly as it would be elsewhere. And learning from her, I found that this wasn't the case at all, even though she herself had passed the doctor's exam in the United States to practice. But anyway, so in the Soviet Union, going back 70 years at least, medicine was highly feminized. So upwards of 70% of practitioners in the Soviet Union were women. So it was highly gendered. And at the same time, there was a kind of vertical hierarchization of medicine insofar as I learned the highest status and highest paid members of the profession were still men, and they were teaching and academic staff largely, and also surgeons. So there was gendering within the field, but overall the field was largely feminized. And the explanation that I got from my grandmother was that women were taken to be ones that were more interested in care and caring and nurturing. And so there was something about their biological dispositions that outfitted them perfectly for the practice of medicine. And so they largely populated the ranks of pediatricians and generalists, internists, et cetera. And I also learned, much to my surprise, that it was a very low paid profession. And in many ways, it mimicked the service economy in the United States. So a large segment of my grandmother's pay in the Soviet Union was through tips, right? So if you wanted your family member to be treated well, you might get chocolates, caviar, vases. So she said much of her income actually came from this sort of tipping system. And I think that the feminization of the field has a lot to do, as we've seen from contemporary social science and sociology. When a field becomes feminized, you start to see larger pay disparities. So when a field becomes feminized, you can expect the salaries to relatively go down, as well as the status and authority of the field. So the way we think about medicine, or the way we think about STEM, is not at all consistent over time, but there's what is often more general or universalized is this idea that gender really matters for the kinds of intellectual or professional interests one has, and that they determine in some way what one does. So moving on from there. So feminists, I'm sorry, my dog is barking. So feminists have critiqued gender essentialism, the sort of essentialism that would lead somebody to think that what you did would, what profession you pursued had much to do with some sort of gendered nature. And they've critiqued gender as a naturalized hierarchy. So like when we use the word gender, feminists have argued that what we're really talking about is a social hierarchy, male, female, woman, man, that is naturalized. So while it's a social phenomena, there's a projection of the social and socially constructed phenomena onto a biological reality. So feminists have said gender refers to a naturalized hierarchy. So it's not just a difference between men and women, it's a difference that also implies a power differential. And it is culturally constructed hierarchy. So the feminists have critiqued any view that the social hierarchy is rooted in either biological difference or the idea of biological hierarchy. So if you're the kind of person who believes that there are biological hierarchies inscribed in nature, then you would disagree with the feminist critique. But most people understand or wouldn't endorse the idea that that reproductive differences imply anything like a social hierarchy. So this aspect of feminist critique isn't particularly controversial, but it's interesting the way some of the descriptions and the literature there is quite insightful. So gender is naturalized often through the idea of a masculine or a feminine essence, again, presumably grounded in natural, physiological, anatomical differences. And this essence is used to explain relevant features about one's personality, including what sorts of interests one pursues or professional decisions one makes. And so when Dr. Mishi was talking about care ethics, the first thing she did was caution us to not understand care ethics, which is elaborated, articulated, and explored in feminist theory, as she cautioned us to not give that an essentialist read. In other words, feminists aren't interested in care ethics because we're the caring sort. Women are essentially caring and men are not. That the caution is there just as it's sort of a general caution that feminists make, don't essentialize, but it is undoubtedly true that women more than men have been, through gender differentiation, have been assigned the roles of caring for children, for the elderly, for people who are dependent, as Dr. Mishi said. And so that has been naturalized or understood as something coming from nature as opposed to socially constructed or socially organized. And so just a brief overview of some of the major critiques that feminists have had of gender essentialism. My talk is really about thinking about the epistemic effects of gender essentialism. So again, if gender essentialism is just that view that there's some sort of feminine or masculine nature that can explain differences in the world, including pay differentials, status differentials, or just simply like splitting of professions, I want to look at the epistemic effects. So epistemic in general just refers to knowledge. Epistemology is the study of knowledge, and epistemic effects are just effects that gender essentialism, beliefs about gender being natural, have on knowledge. And I'm going to look at 3 different areas in which these epistemic effects have been theorized to occur. I'm going to look at the idea of epistemic or testimonial injustice as it's been introduced by some relatively recent work in feminist theory. I'm going to really briefly look at this idea of feminization in a field and what that means for the loss of status, power, and benefits. I'm going to ask whether it's fruitful or productive, perhaps, to think about the current crisis of authority in science as possibly having to do with perceived feminization of disciplines. And we're going to look at gender descriptions of science. So if you gender essentialism not only leads to exclusions of people from fields or exclusions of people from knowledge producing practices, but it also leads to some really questionable and sometimes frankly funny science, right? Because we project back our social ideas onto the world. All right, so I have included the pictures because it's fun to look at practitioners who are doing the work of some of the prominent figures in this field of epistemic or testimonial injustice. I'm just going to read the text that I have here. Testimony has emerged as a central topic in social epistemology. And social epistemology looks like, a lot of times if you've taken a philosophy class, you're encouraged to think about knowledge as an individual affair, as something that happens between you as an individual and the world. And a philosopher like Descartes really encourages that sort of thinking. And a lot of people have knowledge of somebody like Descartes if they've taken an intro to philosophy class. But increasingly, we've seen obviously the extent to which our knowledge is a social process and social production. And we rely on each other and we rely on epistemic authorities in order to be good knowers, right? So we can't do the work or do the research ourselves. And when we do, it's often disastrous or just, not helpful, right? So we rely on others and we have to have a better understanding of these social processes that produce knowledge and less of a bias to think about it as individualistic investigations into the world. So testimony has emerged as a central topic in social epistemology. And generally, feminists have been major contributors to discussion of how social power plays out in the economies of credibility. And I've highlighted that term economies of credibility because I think it's a useful concept to think about. Credibility is not equally distributed and it really follows social hierarchies. And so it's really important, I think, to be attentive to these economies of credibility, whether we're talking about patients or whether we're talking about practitioners or your teachers. And major players in any field. So feminist epistemologists are introducing and talking about this idea of economies of credibility, and they're focusing on the power differentials characteristic of systematic oppression. So whether that is gender-based oppression, race-based oppression, their intersection, or the way, for example, that English becomes the dominant language and so privileges English speakers, to be sure. So focusing on the power differentials characteristic of systemic oppression, Miranda Fricker's 2007 book, Epistemic Injustice, identifies testimonial injustice as one of two forms of epistemic injustice. Testimonial injustice occurs when a speaker is given less credibility than deserved, suffering a credibility deficit because of an identity prejudice held by the hearer. And this just happens all the time. We don't trust people equally. And it's been demonstrated by the best social science and cognitive science that we have, that women just systematically get less credibility than men. Black women get less credibility than white women, and it goes on. And so we need to really be attentive to that in all facets of our work because we want better outcomes. So, for example, a woman might be less likely to be believed because of a prejudice on the part of a hearer regarding her gender. And Fricker argues that although it is correct to view testimonial injustice as an ethical wrong, right? It's an injustice after all. It is important to recognize the wrong as specifically epistemic in nature. It attacks somebody as a knower, not just as, it's not about exclusion versus inclusion or a distribution of a good necessarily. It's really focusing in on the way that one's status as a knower is questioned by one's, like the perception that one is inhabiting a particular social position or place in a hierarchy. Fricker focuses on individual agents, much like a Cartesian subject might. Kristen Dodson in the center and Elizabeth Anderson argue for the need to develop large-scale structural remedies in order to fully correct for the systemic biases that result in testimonial injustice. And so really, one has to look in one's field and try to identify where these instances occur and how to overcome them. And that's, that kind of embedded situational work has to be done in like the specific context when it arises. This is a horrible slide, so please forgive me. I wanted just to give you an example of an epistemic injustice that affects a lot of us as academics or teachers. So we give our students evaluations, and those evaluations to some extent impact our compensation and our perception of success in the field. And so this happens without any modification by the vast literature at this point that says that there's a huge gender bias and to less extent a racial bias in student evaluations. And what I mean by that is that both women of color and white women are relatively more disadvantaged than all men, according to this research. And so these are examples of charts that are taken from a website, Rate My Professor. And for example, the one in the top right, the orange is the men, the blue is the woman, and it's just tracking the amount of times the word genius has been said of a professor. And you can see that genius gap. So women are more likely to be identified when as helpful, as they're more likely to be identified as bossy, right? And men are more likely to be identified as geniuses. And there's an overall tendency to view, so for a student, they'll experience their lack of understanding. When it's a male instructor, they're more likely to experience their lack of understanding as a personal problem. And they're more likely to attribute fault to the instructor for their lack of understanding when it's a woman. So there's huge gender disparities that have been demonstrated in these, and yet we are constantly, every time I apply for a job or do a performance evaluation, here I am submitting my student evaluations. So there really isn't any acknowledgement of just how impactful this sort of epistemic injustice is. Another version of epistemic injustice that I like is, it's called dismissive psychologizing, and we're all familiar with it. So if somebody, if your boss, let's say, is a woman and they express anger or discontent with your job, dismissive psychologizing says, oh, well, she's just PMSing. That's a classic example. We often dismissively psychologize our political enemies. So if somebody, for example, expresses anti-abortion views, we might say, oh, well, they're really just patriarchal, misogynists, and explain views in that way. So dismissive psychologizing is widespread, and it's arguably a form of epistemic injustice because it might have gendered and racial. It's a way to dismiss people's views and give them a different set of motivations for their actions. And I'm curious if the audience has any examples. So if you do, just save those for the end. Examples of epistemic injustice. Hermeneutical injustice is another dimension of epistemic injustice, a problem that feminist inquiry itself tries to solve by providing the concepts and interpretive frameworks to understand the world. So feminist inquiry is actually actively trying to intervene in this idea of hermeneutical injustice by providing us with the conceptual tools. So Fricker also discusses a second and related form of epistemic injustice, which is hermeneutical injustice. Structural prejudice in the economy of collective hermeneutical resources. Hermeneutical injustice occurs when there exists a lack of collective interpretive resources required for a group to understand and express significant aspects of their social experience. So I think that sexual harassment is the classic go-to example. Before there's this word for sexual harassment, there's arguably not enough tools to understand and articulate your experience in a way that would allow you to understand your own sense that something's going wrong in an interaction you've had perhaps, or explain it to others. So hermeneutic injustice affects your own ability to understand the world and the way that social hierarchies impact that. And it also affects your ability to explain what's going on to other people. And so feminist inquiry, I think, really tries to provide the concepts, the rationale, and the interpretive frameworks to do that. Okay, so feminization is something that happens. It's to disciplines and entire fields. So coding was feminized when computer coding was feminized when it first arrived, and the description of the field sort of matched this essentialization of gender. Coding was described as mechanical, as detail-oriented, requiring patience, all of the womanly virtues. And then as soon as coding becomes masculinized, all of a sudden the description of the process and the work becomes completely different, implying supposedly gender essential features like logic, analysis, and genius creativity. So feminization affects how the field is described, and it also has a tremendous effect on the status and power of the field. And a number of times I've had practitioners in STEM tell me that the more that there's like this, biology is now majority woman, there's a bunch of STEM fields that are actually doing quite well in terms of equality and equity in the field. And they're concerned that just at the moment that women gain access to the power and authority of science is precisely the moment when scientific authority is on the wane, along with funding and other social rewards. So something to really be concerned about. I'm also curious to hear from audience about how this sort of issue might play out in medicine and subspecialties and in perceived differentials in status. My favorite example of how gender essentialism plays out is how it gets projected back into our descriptions of the world. And nobody does this, nobody recently has done this as well. I think is Sarah Richardson in her book, Sexing the X. And it's and she talks about how chromosomes became identified as the sex chromosome, and the Y became identified with men and the X with women. And the smaller chromosome is the Y chromosome on the right. And she points out the way that descriptions of the chromosome take on gendered qualities, with the Y being small but rambunctious and the X being large and passive and welcoming, all these kinds of gendered language. And this is an interview excerpt from Sarah Richardson. And she suggests that the whole field of chromosomal science or genetics has become so bogged down with gender essentialist sort of concepts that it should be, or we might consider abandoning the term sex chromosome altogether because it is so distorting. And so here in this interview, I'll just read a little bit. There's just what this interview material suggests is just that we project our ideas about masculinity and femininity onto the actual chromosomes where it has no place. And again, that's another version of naturalizing social hierarchies. The term has led us into the wormhole of thinking of the X as the female chromosome and the Y as the male chromosome, which is totally distorting to the science and the reality. The X and Y have become little representatives of male and female at the genomic level. And that's perpetuated a really strongly binary way of thinking about maleness and femaleness that is both empirically wrong and has misled scientists in a number of episodes, which is really reads like bloopers in the 20th century. So Richardson writes, on the theories of sex determinations in the 1980s, it was believed that scientists would find a single gene on the chromosome and that could be christened the sex determining gene. And critiques of that male-centric model by all sorts of people, including openly feminist identified scientists and gender analysts of science, really transformed the field. It caused scientists to ask tough questions about their model. And now there's a significant effort underway to look at genes all across the genome as playing into reproductive differences and how those emerge and how they matter. So just a real, just an example of how work in feminist theory, even in the humanities, in the social sciences, really impacts scientific practice in the most in important and basic ways. Okay, so I've left, so far, all those people that I've talked about are largely critiquing gender essentialism for the ways that it produces and reproduces bias in the field and excludes people, excludes voices, and excludes points of view. There's a whole set of more radical, by which I mean transformative critiques of scientific objectivity that I think are really interesting. And so I'm going to end my talk on them. One doesn't need to buy into or sign on to some of these radical or transformative critiques. there's plenty of work to be done in the areas that I've already outlined. But if you're the sort of person that really thinks, as I do, that there's deeper problems in terms of power and exclusion in science that require more radical analyses and transformations, some of this material might be more interesting to you. So some of the most interesting and radical work in feminist epistemology emerges with a critique of the notion of scientific objectivity itself. And this ideal of objectivity is of an impartial observer, absolutely disembodied, universal perspective, like God's eye view. And in that ideal, you'll notice the ideal is interesting for what it excludes. For this ideal of objectivity, identity of any sort cannot matter. The situation that you're in, your own particular past or background doesn't matter. Politics of any sort don't matter. For example, ideals about equality, and power doesn't matter, right? Because if power is at work, that means that you don't have the kind of objectivity you want. So identity, politics, and power are ideally excluded in this model of objectivity. They shouldn't matter in science. And I think most people are basically on board with that view. For the feminists that I'm talking about, they say it's precisely these things that really ought to matter. And so we need to have a different understanding of what objectivity consists in that gives some sort of positive role to difference, that acknowledges that power is real, right? And that it's at work. There's no innocent or completely innocent science, right? Science is always interested. It's a huge part of our economy. There's a lot of moneyed interests involved. So this idea of an innocent knowledge is one that they really go after. And I'm thinking of thinkers like Donna Haraway and Harding and Nancy Harstock. So anti-essentialism, according to them, has often been a critique of various forms of gender bias in science, but the critique of this critique is that it leaves this ideal of this objective, power-free knowledge intact and always acts as if hierarchy is some sort of aberration. So some feminists have argued that the idea of basically and fundamentally innocent science or objectivity, a science innocent of power, innocent of domination, is really a subterfuge. It allows for power to sort of continue on in the forms that it has unchecked. And so what they're really calling for is not like, no science, we're going to go do like, rituals in the woods instead of doing science, not at all. They want to acknowledge the myth of neutral science or impartial and powerless discourses, but not in order to escape into relativism or irresponsibility, but really to think what a successor science to our science, which might be a legacy science, what it might look like, what might it be to have better and stronger objectivity. So I want to end by reminding all of us that if you hear this idea that objectivity or science is sometimes called masculinist or imperialist or white, this does not necessarily mean a call to abandon the field of science, right? It might be, but it's usually a call to say, how can we understand this ideal as both denying that there's any kind of partiality in science or that any sort of difference matters? And how can we think about objectivity in different ways that acknowledges, again, that power is irreducible, even ideally? It's really got a transformational goal, which is an attempt to rethink what knowledge and knowledge practices might be if we were not captive to a whole set of oppositions that are arguably refractions of gender essentialism. And here's what I mean by that. We have objectivity, rationality, mind, neutrality, impartiality on the top, and those are all traditionally associated, abstractness, with traditional attributes of male essentialism. And you've got subjectivity, emotion, interested body, situated knowledge, and those are in our scheme of gender essentialism associated with women. And what these more radical transformational thinkers are trying to do is saying, is there any way to break out of this cage of gender essentialism? And they're trying to see the ways in which how we think about objectivity is still a product of gender essentialism. So the idea isn't to like move into relativism or subjectivity. The idea is to transcend these kinds of oppositions and the framework they entail. I've included here some useful further reading and sources, which I'm happy to provide you if you email me or email any of the organizers. And then please email me if you have any questions. Thank you so much for your attention.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Another fantastic presentation. Thank you so much for that. We have 9 minutes, and so there are a couple of questions in the chat. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to direct them to both of you, and you guys can sort of decide who you think should respond. From E.M. Marone, what do you see as the relationship between care ethics and virtue ethics? For instance, distinct theories, care ethics as a type of virtue ethics. Is it compatible or incompatible?
You want to talk, Debbie, or I can talk? I mean,
Go ahead.
okay. I mean, is he allowed to talk? Can I talk with him?
Sure,
Or?
sure, yes.
Okay, so can you tell me what you're thinking about when you're thinking about virtue ethics? Ian, is that right?
Yeah. So,
Oh, EM, sorry.
It's okay.
I'm like, oh, it's a girl.
In previous classes, when we've discussed the sort of female or feminist approach to bioethics through care ethics, it's been related to virtue ethics because it's centered on relationships and kind of exercising certain values or certain virtues in relationships. And so I was kind of wondering what your opinion on that relationship was. It's okay if it's not something that's
I mean, you know, I come at it from a different perspective because of being an English professor, but my sense is, EM, that what's really interesting to me about the care ethics is how much it wants to talk about dependency and vulnerability. And that seems to me a little different from virtue ethics in terms of what you're talking about, right? And I think my talk and Debbie's actually dovetailed beautifully, because I think they're both about like thinking in two ways about, you know, the sort of justice model and then some alternative model, right? And as I said, I mean, what I find really fascinating about the ethics of care is the way in which it actually goes into exploring this sense of that if we made dependency primary, right? That if we recognize that dependency is something that we all have and experience, that it would change the nature of the way we think about things. So for me, it's that dependency issue. And Kate is really, I mean, I find her books just magical. And her work comes out of the fact that she has a severely disabled daughter, and she writes about it. So she has somebody she will care for her entire life. Right. And that made her rethink the nature of the world. Right. Does that answer your question? I mean, so for me, that's a little different from virtue remains, I think, more in the sort of realm of the abstraction of the sort of abstract values. Right. I mean, then the other thing I love about care theory is how much it's about practice. I mean, if you read it, they talk over and over again about that it's not always fun, that it's not always something you want to do, that it's not the sentimental I heart you, right? That the practice of caring for someone else is difficult, but also essential to who we are, and we don't recognize that enough, right?
I would add, I think that's a really great question. And I mean, virtue ethics is usually associated with Aristotle, and there's some really beautiful aspects to it. For example, it's anti-essentialist in the sense that it doesn't assume that we're determined by any kind of nature, as much as we're determined, like who we are is about what we want to become, right? And so practicing to be courageous makes you courageous for Aristotle. And obviously he thinks we need to start when we're very young, and that if we don't start when we're young, we're already like too vicious by the time we're adults to really fix things. I think that if you take in plasticity into account, we can all become, so virtue was associated with flourishing and what it took to flourish, right? So like what humans are, right, is like the virtues direct humans to the sorts of activities that lead us to become better versions of ourselves so that we can lead our best lives. But I do think that because there's this model of human flourishing that probably tends to privilege individuals and their capacity to be independent, right? That's what we think of as maximal flourishing. Like you're independent, you don't rely on others. Maybe you're magnanimous, maybe you're empathetic, all those things, but we're really going for this idea of this independent flourishing agent. And dependency is usually seen as something that is the absence of like flourishing. And
Right.
the people who care for those who are dependent are seen as wasting their lives or their talents, or, you know, that would otherwise be well mobilized for more productive aims. And so it really, I think that it's not in any way opposed to virtue ethics per se, but like it's really hard for us culturally, I think, to value dependency. And that's also like gender essentialism.
Well, and I think the word virtue is the same root as the Latin word for man, right? Virile, vir is in virtue, right?
Yeah, power. Mhm.
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, for me, it's almost like virtue is about uprightness, right? And all of that, and self-reliance and all those kinds of things. And there's another realm that we can explore that's a space up where one is virtuous and moral, but in a very different way, right?
Okay, thank you. Thank you for those responses. I think I think dependency could be, I can stick a sign in my front yard that it's a virtue. You know, maybe we could use it for dependency. We have time for one more comment. And so we've got one from Carol Gerson. I think this is directed to you, Dr. Goldgaber. It's an example of dismissive psychologizing that you had asked for. So let's close with this one. A young, brilliant otolaryngologist, ear doctor, had 4 papers to present at the national meeting. Outside the lecture hall, she heard a very senior and highly respected male professor say, quote, "Did you see that this woman had 4 papers accepted for this meeting? I wonder who she slept with to get all of them on the program," end quote. And she wouldn't allow the highly offended women she told about this to confront the man because he could impair her career because of his power in the field. Could you respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, it's not just an example of dismissive psychologizing. It's an example of just of epistemic dismissal, right? So it's like, here's an example of how that like functionally works. But it's true. It's like planting this idea that what's really going on with the person is that they're achieving what they have through, and it calls the attention back to gender. Like, so it's an example of sexual harassment, because sexual harassment is that thing which makes you conscious of gender and then the gender hierarchy at the very moment that you need to perform or do something. And so in a sense, need to escape your gender to be taken seriously as an agent and a knower, right? So it's this undermining somebody's credibility. It's undermining their status as a knower. And this person is doing it, whether consciously or not, in order to keep that economy of credibility right? So that, such that it mirrors the social hierarchies that we're trying to get past. So I mean, the example is just so rich with like everything that goes wrong, and you really hope that like, you know, eventually these people that are policing that economy of credibility will retire or you know, go away. But I mean, that remains to be seen.
Okay, thank you so much for that. We have tons of comments coming into the chat. So if you guys would like to reach out to either of these scholars, they are happy to have you do so. And we can, if you can, I think that they have posted their emails in the chat. And if anybody needs that contact info, let us know. We will be offering feminist theory and practice in medicine in the spring of 2022. We are delighted to say. So hopefully some of you will consider taking that course. All of the matters and topics that were discussed today will be very much a part of our course in the spring. It has been a pleasure to have everybody. Thank you so much for joining us, and see you next time.